Good afternoon and welcome to Washington Week's digital show, Washington Week Recommends. I'm Yamiche Alcindor. Each week, I recommend great reporting that I think deserves your attention. And today I want to highlight important work by Emmanuel Felton. He's the race and ethnicity reporter at the Washington Post. Now, his recent article is a fascinating look at one city's controversial program aimed at addressing reparations, an issue America, of course, has struggled with since the 18th century. That article is headlined, quote, Providence offers reparations to address racism. White people can apply. And Emmanuel joins me now. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome to Washington Week Recommend. So I wanted to start by talk to me a little bit about what Providence, Rhode Island is trying to do here and how this program came about.
Yeah, so Providence is a part of this nascent movement around the country among states and municipalities to sort of, step into the gap that the federal government has failed to really take action in, right? So we're waiting for HR 40, this big bill in Congress that would authorize a federal study into reparations. And so there are a bunch of folks on the local level who are like, you know what, we can't wait for that. We have to start doing work to close this gigantic wealth gap that we have in our country that is because of the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow and then redlining and the housing policies after World War II. So Providence has taken an interesting path forward, right? So one of the tricky bits is how do you fund reparations, right? And so what Providence was doing is they were looking for cash in their budget to do it. And what they decided to do was use COVID relief dollars. That was a tricky decision to make because those federal dollars had to be spent in a race-neutral manner. And so that was the problem that Providence began to engage with. And so what they ended up doing was creating four criteria that would qualify a resident of Providence for reparations. 1, you're of Black ancestry. 2, you're of Native ancestry. 3, you make less half of the area median income. Or 4, you live in one of these qualified census tracts. These are low-income neighborhoods, essentially. And what we found at the Post was that 50% of Providence's white residents lived in one of these low-income neighborhoods. So it created this issue for Providence. And I think they're still grappling with what they're going to do. That they're trying to create a program that will close the racial wealth gap in the city, but much of the white residents qualify for it themselves.
And you write that this policy came as a result of the murder of George Floyd. Tell me a little bit about the impetus for this, how the murder of that Black man, how that led to this movement.
Yeah, so I think in a lot of cities, I talked to the mayor of Providence, and there was this sense that we have to do something, right? And so there had already been some conversations. Evanston, Illinois, for example, passed one of the first reparations programs on the local level in 2019, but it wasn't until 2021 that they funded their program as well. So it was in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and the protests that hit the streets of cities like Evanston around the country that, there was this pressure on elected officials, we have to do something, we have to right the wrongs of our country's history if we're going to end this kind of, this cycle of murder or, of police deaths and then the protests that follow. How do we break this chain and finally implement policies that would address some of the issues that lead to, Black men and Black women being much more likely to be killed in police custody.
It's an interesting to talk about sort of how they got there. I want to bring up this issue of language. You interviewed Danny Ritchie, who's a clinical assistant professor of family medicine at Brown University. He says calling this reparations is, quote, dangerous. That's the word that he used. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about why calling it reparations is dangerous in his mind, and overall, is it still reparations?
Well, and this is a debate that's dividing the reparations community across the country, right? So would they sort of fall into two camps? One is saying this is a great step forward, that these local movements are creating the environment where we can have the national conversation and move federal reparations, that is direct cash payments in their mind, hopefully for descendants of slavery. So that's one side of the argument. The other side of the argument, which Ritchie's really a part of, is this idea that you know what, this is muddying the waters. That there's going to be a sense in a few years, well, we tried reparations and it didn't work. Look at Providence, look at Evanston. They still have these huge racial gaps. Reparations don't work. And that's the concern that many of the folks who are against these measures, especially the measures that don't include direct cash payments, that are more programmatic approaches to reparations, that is investing in neighborhoods, like sort of some of the very same things that we've already seen done that, like, haven't really moved the needle, right? So in Evanston, Illinois, for example, they're doing a housing voucher program, $25,000 to help families either buy a house or do repairs on their current home. But in a city where the average home price is $500,000, it's really tough to see how far that $25,000 housing voucher is going to go. And there's this sense that really what will make a difference in people's lives is cash that will, that they can decide how to use.
And when we have been as a country having this debate about reparations for a while now. You brought it up, and I want to ask you about it. H.R. 40. It's of course that federal bill that has been in the House since at least, and I want to look at it since 1989. And it's a bill to study reparations. It's not a bill to give reparations, but it's a bill to study the issue. Where does that stand and factor into all of this?
Yeah, so H.R. 40 is a study bill. It's modeled off the study bill that eventually led to reparations for Japanese Americans for internment, which was signed by President Reagan in the 1980s. And so they're modeling their journey after the journey of Japanese Americans. I spoke to Representative Sheila Jackson Lee, who's like really taken on this as one of her defining achievements, or what she hopes to be one of her defining achievements in Congress, and has taken the manner of reintroducing this bill every congressional session. Last I spoke to her in the spring, she feels like she has the votes in the House, but she knows that given the Senate's current makeup, and given that you need 60 votes really to move anything in the U.S. Senate at this point, that there's not a path forward there. So what she's been calling on the president to do is to sign an executive order that, like you said, wouldn't grant reparations tomorrow, but would start a study process that would mirror the process that Japanese Americans went through.
And reading about Sheila Jackson Lee, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee making that push, is there any sense based on your reporting that could happen?
Biden and other Democrats were supportive of the idea of reparations during the 2020 Democratic primary. And so I think her hope is to put some pressure on him, maybe toward the end of this term, maybe early next term, if he's in fact reelected, to get this going. But I think, polling suggests that reparations is still not a generally popular idea, especially among white Americans.
And I want to go back to the story about Rhode Island in particular. What's the potential impact of the program on people there? Do they feel like if they are able to pull this off and are able to put some financial resources toward these sort of historically disadvantaged communities, that they'll be able to have a sort of real significant impact in people's lives?
That's the hope. I mean, what the mayor says is this is $10 million invested in long neglected communities, an investment that they wouldn't have made without this reparations program, right? So the question is, though, a lot of this money is flowing through the same nonprofits that have long served these communities, the same government entities that have long served these communities, that have really failed to so far change the outcome for folks growing up in those neighborhoods. So, I mean, that's the question moving forward. Is $10 million in a city of nearly 200,000 people enough to really move the needle? I think we'll have to wait and see.
And as we wait to see what happens in Rhode Island, I wonder how much your reporting tells you about whether or not what they're doing in that state could be a blueprint for other cities. I was thinking about one of your colleagues in Virginia. I mean, one of your colleagues at the Washington Post wrote about Virginia and a family there that's profited off of slavery. There, of course, was a story in California where there was that beachfront property that was returned to an African-American family. I wonder what you make of sort of the blueprint that's happening across the country and what that could mean for other cities.
Yeah. Just last week, I was at the second annual symposium of local and state leaders for municipal and state reparations. Right, so this is a part of this is at the vanguard of a movement that we're seeing spread across the country. It may have started in Evanston, but we're seeing it pop up in Providence, and there are actually folks working together to expand this to more and more cities and states. The question is, it still goes back to that battle. Is what these cities and states are doing reparations, and will they actually finally close some of these like really wide, racial wealth gaps we see in cities across the country?
And then to that point, you quote a Native American tribal leader who's pretty critical of the program in Rhode Island, talking about the fact that people would rather have their land returned and their burial places preserved. I wonder what you've been hearing from the Native American community and how much that factors into what happens next.
Yeah, I mean that it's interesting that Rhode Island included the Native American community. That's not the case in a lot of these programs, and I thought it was a really interesting element to theirs. Yeah, I think once again what a lot of these community members would say is we want more engagement, we want more of a say in how this money will be spent, and less decisions being made by the sort of like nonprofit infrastructure that has been making these decisions for a long time, right? So they're like, listen to us. We know what's best for our communities. What we want is access to the ocean in Providence or in Rhode Island for the Native communities there, and we want essentially access to these sacred burial grounds that have been misused or mistreated for so many decades and centuries at this point.
And Emmanuel, obviously, Washington Week focuses so much on making sure we have great reporters like you coming on. And I wonder what you make of how this conversation has changed because of reporting on reparations. I'm thinking about Ta-Nehisi Coates, his groundbreaking essay in the Atlantic that was the case for reparations. I'm thinking of Nicole Hannah-Jones, who not only created the 1619 Project to explain to people the consequences of slavery, but also had her own New York Times Magazine piece specifically on reparations. What do you make of sort of how the coverage of this has impacted people's thinking?
No, I think there's no question that in a lot of ways, reporters and the media have been on the vanguard of this and that have really started this conversation. I can't tell you how many people I've talked to across the country who say it was Ta-Nehisi Coates' The Case for Reparations that really started their communities and themselves thinking about what could we do to make reparations real and to finally, try to make up for some of the more negative, some of the worst aspects of our history.
Yeah. Well, Emmanuel, of course, you are one of the other reporters that is shining a light on this. So thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your reporting. And thanks, of course, to all of you for joining us and for watching Washington Week Recommends every week. You can find us here every Friday at 12:30 p.m. Eastern. And be sure, of course, to tune in tonight to Washington Week on PBS. We'll discuss Senator Kyrsten Sinema's departure from the Democratic Party and what it means for the control of the Senate. We'll also talk about Raphael Warnock's historic win in the Georgia Senate runoff race. So look forward to seeing you tonight, and thank you so much for watching.